Hi everyone, my name is Rob. Today I'm going to be doing an instructional video on how DMV will perform the pre-trip with you when you go to take your driver's test. When you go down to DMV, in the past what they used to do is just make you pre-trip the entire truck. Now they're going to break it into sections. You're going to have section A, which is from the firewall forward, section B, which is from the firewall to the taillights of the tractor, and section C is the trailer. Everyone does the coupling device no matter what section you get, and everybody does the in-cab. So we're going to go over all those things, kind of just do a sample pre-trip for you, and hopefully you'll be successful when you go down to DMV to take your test. Alright, so if DMV were to give you section A, which is the section I'm going to demonstrate right now, they're going to tell you, I want you to point to or touch the items that you're looking at. So I always like to use a bright colored stick so that I can show you what I'm pre-tripping. The instructions are also going to be pre-trip one side of the truck, tell me what's different or unique on the other side. Don't forget you also have to do the front of the truck. So I'm going to start at the front of the truck. When I check the front of the truck, I'm basically going to generally look at my lights. When I look at my lights, I want to make sure that all my lights are clean. They're not cracked, damaged, or broken. They're the proper color. Amber to the front, red to the rear. You're also going to tell the DMV examiner that you'll check their function a little bit later on in your pre-trip. When they check your function check will double as theirs. Anyway, I'm also going to look underneath the vehicle. I want to make sure there's no puddles. I'm going to make sure the vehicle's not leaning to one side or the other. Then I'm going to go over to the hood, and I'm going to unlatch the hood, raise the hood up, and their instructions are going to be to pre-trip everything. So what I like to do is have a pattern or a flow where I start at the firewall, go to the radiator area, and then top to bottom, left to right, as I'm doing the pre-trip. And then when I get down to my frame, I'm just going to basically work my way out. And I like to, when I'm working my way out, I like to break it down by component. So I'll follow all the steering components until they disappear, and then I'll use the frame kind of as home base, and what else is attached to it. I'll take all the suspension components until they disappear, and then I'll go back to home base, which is the frame, and then I will follow that brake line out to the brake chamber and so on. So anyway, this just to let you know where I'm going with this so you don't think that I'm just jumping all around. I do have a pattern or a flow, and it's almost like reading a book, top to bottom, left to right. Open the page, go to the back page. Anyway, so the firewall right here, I'm going to check these lines and hoses. I make sure they're not cracked, they're not bulging, they're not leaking. Remember, anything that could leak, you want to tell them they're not leaking. I'm going to check my fuse box right here. This is actually part of the in-cab, but since they're there, I'm going to say that I've got extra fuses, and these are resettable circuit breakers. My windshield washer fluid right here, I want to make sure the cap is on. I want to make sure it's filled to the proper operating level, and I want to make sure it's not leaking also. From here, I'm going to go over to my radiator area. When I check my radiator area, I'm going to check these lines and hoses. I'm going to make sure there's no rips, cuts, tears in it. I'm going to make sure the clamps are on tight, and don't forget that all-important L word, not leaking. Right? I'm also going to check my general area, my radiator, for leaks. Leaks being the key word, the DMV examiners are listening for that. I'm still checking my engine for leaks, and I'm just going top to bottom. And when I come to an item that they need to hear about, which is going to be my alternator is securely fastened with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. Is it belt driven or gear driven? It's belt driven. We'll talk about that belt in a little bit. But I want to make sure the wires are all securely attached. They're not taped, they're not cut, they're not corroded. And I did mention that it's belt driven, so when I check my belt on my alternator, I want to make sure it's not ripped, it's not cut, it's not torn, it's not cracked, and at the center of the belt, there's no greater than 3/4 of an inch. So going over to my next word in my sentence right here, basically I'm going to check my engine oil right here. This is my cap, this is where I would fill it, this is where I would check it. When I check the engine oil, I want to make sure it's filled to the proper operating level above the add line on the dipstick. I want to make sure the caps are on tight, and again, they're not leaking. My power steering reservoir is right next to it on this truck. Again, the cap is secured, it's not cracked, it's it's not leaking, it's filled to the proper operating level, and it's on tight. All the way in the back is where my air compressor is right here. So my air compressor, again, is mounted securely with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. It's belt driven or gear driven. So this is gear driven because there's no belt anywhere near it on this truck. On other trucks it might be different, so I'll keep that in mind. The lines and hoses that are coming off of my air compressor are not cracked, they're not bulging, they're not leaking, and again, the air compressor is in good operating condition. It's not leaking also. Underneath the air compressor on this truck is a power steering pump. Power steering pump is also mounted securely with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts, and it's also not leaking. All the lines and hoses that are coming off the power steering pump are also not cracked, they're not bulging, they're not leaking. Okay, so that pretty much takes care of this side of the engine, but we're going to continue on with the frame right here. So we're going to go to the frame, and then we're going to get all the stuff that's attached to it. That way you're breaking it down by component, you're not lost because there's a lot of stuff going on right here. So I started at the frame. I want to make sure the frame is straight, it's not cracked, bent, or broken. I also make sure there's no welding repairs on it, there's no holes that are drilled into it with a cutting torch or anything. Now attached to my frame, again, I got a lot of stuff going on here. I'm going to start with my steering. I'm going to check this input shaft here. I want to make sure the input shaft is straight, not cracked, bent, broken, not extremely worn. It's held in place with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts here, and everything's properly lubricated. Okay, we've already covered the power steering fluid, so that's good. So that leads into my steering box right here. My steering box is also mounted securely here with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. Notice how I'm pointing to everything with my stick here. My steering box is also doesn't have any damage to it. It's also not leaking because it does hold fluid. So again, I want to check these lines and hoses to make sure they're not ripped, cut, cracked, frayed. They're not leaking. Coming off of my steering box is all my steering linkage. They don't need to know the names of all the steering linkage, but they do need you to point to it. And what they're listening for is for castlets and Carter keys, excessive wear, and everything's properly lubricated. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. I point to each part. This is my pitman arm, this is my drag link, my steering knuckle, my tie rod, and my tie rod end. Again, you got 3 castlets and Carter keys on this steering linkage. Again, they're all securely fastened, none are broken, loose, or missing. Okay, and then I go back to the frame, and what else is attached to the frame is my suspension. So I'm going to start with what comes off the frame here is my spring mounts. When I check my spring mounts, again, I want to make sure they're mounted securely, again with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. There's no damage to them, they're not cracked, bent, broken. The bushings are all intact and they're properly lubricated. This is a leaf spring suspension. Some of your suspensions could be different. When we get to the rear axles, you'll have to tell them what those differences are if you get that section. We'll go over that a little bit later on though. But the U-bolts are what holds the leaf springs to the axle. So when I check these U-bolts, I want to make sure they're not cracked, they're not bent, they're not broken. And I'm going to go down and actually touch these nuts or bolts on the bottom and make sure that they're all fastened also. Again, nothing broken, loose, or missing. Another part of my suspension is my shock absorber. Not all trucks have a shock absorber. On my rear axles of my trailer, they're going to be totally different. No shock absorber, just PreTrip what you see. So my shock absorber is mounted securely both on the top and the bottom. I want to make sure there's no damage to my shock absorber. Damage being a little bit of a vague word. It's not cracked, it's not bent, it's not broken, and it does hold fluid, so it's also not leaking any fluid. So now that completes my suspension. I go back to the frame, and I'm going to pick another part that's attached to the frame that's going to lead me out to the wheel. And so I'm just going to follow the brake line. Brake line is securely fastened. It's not cracked, it's not bent, it's not bulging, it's not kinked. Again, it's not leaking. It leads into my brake chamber right here. My brake chamber is securely fastened to the backing plate with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to make sure the clamp around my brake chamber, which is really important with the DMV, doesn't have any damage to it, no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. And finally, the brake chamber is not leaking. Okay, no damage to the brake chamber. Coming out of my brake chamber, I have a push rod. The push rod I can pull no greater than 1 inch when pulled by hand for proper adjustment. There's no damage to my push rod. Damaged, not cracked, bent, broken. It's held in place to my slack adjuster here with no broken, loose, and missing nuts or bolts, pins, clips, hardware, anything that's holding it together. My slack adjuster itself is also mounted securely. It's properly lubricated. There's no broken, loose, and missing nuts or bolts. It's not damaged. That leads, I'm going to stay with the brakes. That stays with my brakes. That leads me to the inspection slot right here. And then for the inspection slot on the brakes, I want to make sure that my brake shoes are 1/4 inch minimum thickness. I want to make sure there's no oil or grease in my brake shoes. I want to make sure the brake shoes are not deteriorating, they're not cracking apart or anything like that. And then from there, there's a gap, and the gap for the brake shoes should be not exceed 1/8 inch for proper adjustment. If it's too far away, it won't make contact with the drum, basically. So no greater than 1/8 inch away. The brake drum itself is round. It's not cracked, damaged, or broken. There's no oil or grease on my brake shoes or my brake drum, and there's no welding repairs. There's no chunks missing out of it. So now that I'm done with the brakes, I'm going to go up to the top of the tire. I'm just going to basically be the water pouring over the tire. I'm going to take it all the way down. So first thing I'm going to check is my tread depth. My tread depth on these front steer tires should be no less than 4/32 of an inch for proper tread depth. Even wear across the top of the tread. I'm going to make sure there's no chunks, there's no cord separation, no nails stuck in the tread, any kind of damage to it. Remember, on the rear tires, it's 2/32 of an inch, and you can have recaps. I'm also going to check the sidewall of the tire. I want to make sure there's no rips, there's no cuts, there's no tears, there's no bulges, any kind of manufacturer defects. And from here, I'm going to check the bead around the rim. I'm going to make sure that it's properly seated. I'm going to make sure there's no leaks. I'm going to check my rim itself here. I want to make sure my rim is not dented. I want to make sure there's no cracks in my rim. I also want to make sure there's no welding repairs on my rim. It's against the law to weld a rim. From here, I'm going to go to my lug nuts. I'm going to make sure I got no broken, loose, or missing lug nuts. I always include that I could tell I had a broken, loose, or missing lug nut if I had rust trails or shiny threads coming out of the threads, or if it wasn't there. And then from here, I'm going to go to my hub seal here. And when I check my hub seal, first thing I want to make sure it's mounted securely with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. And then the magic word, it's not leaking. This is an item that we can check the fluid in. So I got a little sight glass here. I want to make sure it's filled to the proper operating level above the add line. There is no dipstick on it. The last thing that I always do, just it's my preference, is I check my valve stem. When I check my valve stem, I'm going to make sure the valve stem is straight, not cracked, bent, broken. This one has a cap on it. This is also where I would check the air pressure to make sure it's filled to the proper operating pressure. It's usually listed on the tire with an air gauge. Okay, and now DMV's instructions would be, after you do one side, to go over to the other side and just tell me what's different or unique. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to follow the same pattern or the same flow, but we're just going to talk about the things that are different. And there's not a whole lot of stuff that's different on this side. So let's go on over there. So again, I start from the firewall again, go over to my radiator area, and then everything in between. There's nothing on the firewall that's a scoreable item on this side, so I'll go right over to my coolant reservoir. When I check my coolant reservoir, I want to make sure it's filled to the proper operating level above the add line. I want to make sure the cap is on tight, it's not leaking. I want to make sure the canister is not leaking. All the lines and hoses aren't leaking. Again, I'm still checking for leaks on my radiator area. I don't see any. Brings me to my water pump right here. My water pump is, again, it's mounted securely with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. It's belt driven. I've already checked the belt on the other side, no greater than 3/4 of an inch at the center of the belt. No rips, cuts, cracks, frays in it. But more importantly on the water pump, make sure you tell them that it's not leaking. A lot of people leave out that leaking thing. Anyway, from here I'm just going to go to my engine, top to bottom, left to right. Well, the only thing that's different on this side really is the exhaust, but on the DMV score sheet, the exhaust isn't included, but I always include it because I think it's important. So I'm going to make sure I check for soot or carbon buildup, which would indicate an exhaust leak. I also want to make sure that I don't have any excessive rust. If the engine were started, I could hear an exhaust leak. The exhaust is really part of Part B. We'll get to that a little bit later on, but it'll be the same information. Anyway, there's nothing else really. Everything from the frame to the outside of the tire is exactly the same as the other side. The only thing that I see different on this truck, which is not a squirrelable item, is the fuel filter here. Just to say it's mounted securely and it's not leaking. So now the DMV examiner would ask you, are you done with your pre-trip on Section A? And you would say, yes, I'm done with the pre-trip on Section A. And they will lead you over to the next item that they're going to have you look at, which is going to be the coupling device, which is the fifth wheel in this case. And you'll do the coupling device, and then they'll ask you if you're done with that, and then they'll proceed to the in-cab. So we'll do it in sections. All right, so now DMV would take you over to the fifth wheel. Again, their instructions are going to be pre-tip the items that you're looking at, point to it or touch them. That's why I have my little pointer here. Pre-trip one side of the vehicle, tell me what's different or unique on the other side. I don't think there's anything different on the fifth wheel on the other side, so we're just going to do this. So what I'll do is I'll start down here at the bottom at the base of the fifth wheel, and I'm going to check all these mounting bolts, and I'm going to check that the base is mounted securely to the frame here with no broken, loose, or missing mounting bolts. And then I'm going to go up a level, and this is a sliding fifth wheel, so it has teeth right here. And what's the condition of the teeth? Are they welded, are they bolted, or securely mounted? These are both bolted and welded. So also, since this is a sliding fifth wheel, with the trailer hooked up, I want to make sure I have proper clearance for the landing gear to not hit the mud flaps. And also, since it's a sliding fifth wheel, I want to make sure it's not going to accidentally slide. So I want to make sure that these pins right here are securely in the latch position. And what controls the pins are all this hardware in here, airline, no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. There's a piston here. I want to make sure that all that's in good condition and nothing's leaking. So attached to the teeth right here is my platform. Platform is that pyramid looking thing here. I'm going to make sure the platform is in good condition. It's not cracked, it's not bent, it's not broken also. And then just moving up a level, what's attached to the platform is my fifth wheel skid plate right here. Well, before I hooked up my fifth wheel skid plate, I want to make sure that it's properly greased. I want to make sure there's no cracks in it. And remember, your trailer is going to be on top of this, so you won't be able to see this. This is just a better view. So I also want to make sure that there's no gap in between my trailer and my fifth wheel. So I want to make sure that it's sitting flush in there. And then DMV is going to want you to go around to the back of the fifth wheel, and they're going to want you to look up inside of the slot right here to make sure that the locking jaws are locked around the shank of the kingpin. So now I just said kingpin, so the kingpin is back here in the trailer. The kingpin, before I hooked it up, is straight, not cracked, damaged, or broken. There's no excessive wear on it or anything. And it's attached to my apron right here. So my apron is also securely fastened to the frame with welds. So I want to make sure that it's no broken, loose, and missing welds, cracked welds. I want to make sure everything's properly lubricated. All right. And so now what controls those locking jaws? The hitch release lever here. So I want to make sure that hitch release lever is in the locked and latched and it's in engaged position. And there's also a check mark on it for safety latch. Some of the trucks will have it where you have to pull it up before you got to pull it, or a lever you got to pull. Just tell them it's in the locked and latched and safety latch position. And then from here we're going to do the airlines. We'll probably do those airlines when the truck's hooked up. But some of the things you're checking for, you're going to make sure your glad hands are in good condition. And make sure there's no rips, cuts, or tears in them. You want to make sure that they're properly connected, red to red, blue to blue. And make sure the lines themselves are not kinked, they're not cracked, they're not cut, they're not bulging. And make sure they're long enough to permit proper turning, but they're not so long where they're dragging on the deck. Again, we're probably going to do this with it hooked up again so you can see. I'm going to follow those airlines all the way back to the cab. I'm going to make sure that they're properly connected at the cab also. DMV gives you a point for the connection at the cab and for a connection at the trailer. So, and the airlines themselves. So just make sure that we'll talk about the condition. We'll probably redo that when it's when we hook it up. All right. Remember the leaking word. Nothing's leaking. So that kind of concludes the fifth wheel. So the DMV examiner would then tell you, ask you, are you done with your fifth wheel? And you say, yeah, I'm done with it. And they're going to say, okay, we're going to hop into the in-cab. You're going to do the air brake test in the in-cab, and I'll go over that next. That's it. All right, so I just got finished with section A, along with the fifth wheel, along with the in-cab. Now, if you didn't get section A, they could give you section B. Now, section B would be from the firewall of the truck, basically to the taillights of the tractor, okay? Again, their instructions are gonna be point to or touch the items that you're looking at, go down one side of the truck and just tell me what's different or unique on the other side. Again, I'm gonna use my special pointer here. So I follow the same kind of pattern or flow where I go top to bottom, left to right. I usually take a section of the truck about the width of my arms. That way I won't get lost. I won't be jumping around all over the place. I do that for all my pre-trips. So starting at the top, I'm going to check my mirrors. I want to make sure that the mounts are all securely fastened. Nothing's cracked, bent, or broken. I want to make sure that my mirrors themselves are clean. They're clear. I want to make sure that they're properly adjusted for me when I get inside of the cab a little bit later on. I'm going to check the condition of my door, just the general condition of the outside. I'm going to open the door up and I'm going to check my door hinges. When I check my door hinges again, I'm looking for broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to actually physically pull on the door to make sure it's not loose. I want to make sure it opens from the inside and the outside. And I'm going to check this weather stripping here to make sure the weather stripping is not cracked, not ripped, not cut, not torn, and it doesn't appear to be leaking. Okay, remember the L word. And then I'll close the door, make sure that it locks and locks from the inside. And I've got a little light right here. This is a turn signal marker light. So I would check this light to make sure it's clean, it's not cracked, damaged, or broken, and the proper color. Remember, it's always amber to the front, red to the rear. I'm going to check these steps right here. When I check these steps, I'm going to check how they're mounted. These are bolted, so some are welded. It depends on your situation. But there's no tripping hazards on the steps, any oil or grease, any kind of tools, anything that's going to cause you to slip and fall. Don't worry about the battery box. Don't worry about the air tanks. They're not scoreable items. So I'm just going to move it over about another 4 feet. I'm going to go right to my frame here. When I check my frame, I want to make sure my frame doesn't have any cracks, bends, or breaks in it. I want to make sure there's no illegal holes that are drilled into it or burned into it with a cutting torch. I want to make sure there's no welding repairs. It's straight. I'm also going to check my cross members just the same way, just to make sure that everything's intact. Catwalk, I want to make sure that my catwalk is mounted securely, again with no broken, loose, and missing nuts or bolts or welds. I also want to make sure there's no tripping hazards on my catwalk. Tripping hazards could be oil, grease, wrenches, anything that's going to cause me to trip or fall and fall off the truck. And then I'm just going to progressively work my way out. I'm going to check my fuel tank straps. Make sure my fuel tank straps are all securely fastened. The fuel tank's not shifted. I want to make sure the fuel tank doesn't have any dents in it. I don't want to make sure it doesn't have any cracks in it. Obviously, I want to make sure it's not leaking. On this truck, it's equipped with a DEF tank also. I would check this tank exactly the same way. And since it does have DEF fluid, I want to make sure that I have at least 1/8 of a tank of DEF fluid before I take my truck down to DMV to test. I'll check these steps here exactly the same as I checked those. No need to go over stuff over and over again if you've already covered it. And now I'm going to go to the inside of the truck. And when I go to the inside of the truck in here, I'm going to check my dry shaft area. And you might have to get down on the ground to see it because the trailer might be on top of it. But when I check my dry shaft, I'm going to make sure that it's round, it's straight, there's not cracked, nothing's cracked, damaged, or broken on it. I want to make sure there's nothing foreign wrapped around it, like maybe barbed wire or, string, nuts or bolts or anything. I want to make sure that when I do check the nuts and bolts there, they're all securely attached. What that does, it brings me to the center of my axle. So I'm going to work from the center of my axle out. And section B is a little hard to see some of the stuff, so bear with me. I'll just go down there and show you what I got. So the first thing at the center of my axle is the brake lines. The brake lines, I would check them just like the front. They're not ripped, they're not cut, they're not torn, they're not leaking, they're not kinked. They're attached to my brake chamber. Brake chamber is the same information as the front. Make sure that it's not dented. I want to make sure the clamp around my brake chamber is also securely fastened. No broken, loose, and missing nuts or bolts. And then don't forget to mention leaks. And then coming out of my brake chamber, you might have to hunt around a little bit I'm going to check the condition of my push rods. I'm going to make sure my push rods are securely fastened. They're not cracked, bent, or broken. When I pull my push rod, I want to make sure I can pull it no greater than 1 inch when pulled by hand for proper adjustment. Push rod leads into my slack adjuster here. My slack adjuster is also mounted securely. It's not cracked, bent, or broken also. And then from there, I'm just going to continue on with my brakes. I'm going to check in the inspection slot here to make sure that I got a 1/4 inch minimum thickness on the brake shoes. I'm going to make sure there's no oil or grease on my brake shoes. I want to make sure there's no deterioration of the brake shoes, no cracks or breaks in it. The gap in between the brake shoes, I want to make sure that it's not any greater than 1/8 of an inch for proper adjustment. And my brake drum itself, I want to make sure that it's round. I want to make sure there's no cracks in it. I want to make sure there's no chunks missing out of it. And again, no oil or grease on it. So now that I'm done with the brake section there, I'm going to go to my suspension. And when I get done with this, when I do the suspension, I'm going to follow them off the frame. I'm going to check my spring mounts right here. Spring mounts are securely fastened, again, with no broken, loose, and missing nuts or bolts. To make sure my spring mounts themselves don't have any damage to them. They're not cracked, bent, broken. Attached to my spring mounts are my leaf springs right here. So I want to make sure I got no broken, loose, or missing or shifted leaf springs. My leaf springs are attached to the axle here with U-bolts. So I want to make sure that those U-bolts are all securely fastened with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts on the bottom. Again, it's going to be a verbal pre-trip for this one part of it. And then some suspensions will have a torsion arm, which is a straight arm bar. I can show you better on the trailer when you see it. This particular suspension has a helper spring. And what that does is it adds extra weight, adds extra suspension with the more weight you put on it. So anyway, I'll check the condition of that helper spring and tell them that it's not equipped with a torsion arm. All right. The next thing I would check is my shock absorber. When I check my shock absorber, I want to make sure that it's securely mounted both on the top and the bottom. I want to make sure there's no damage to my shock absorber. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. And it does have fluid in it, so I want to make sure it's not leaking. Well, what's different from my front suspension here is I got an airbag. So this airbag is also mounted securely with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts, both on the top and the bottom. I want to make sure the airbag is in good condition. It's not ripped, it's not cut, it's not gouged, it's not torn, and it's also not leaking any air. Okay? From here I'm going to do the tires. So these are dually tires where when I did the front earlier. A little bit of different specifications here. These tires, minimum tread depth is 2/32 of an inch, and you can have recaps on the rear. Also, since I have dualies, I'm going to make sure there's no debris stuck in between the tread or in between the tires. And also I'm looking for the presence of a spacer block. And what a spacer block does is it's an iron block that makes the wheel print a little bit wider. We don't run them on right now, so I want to make sure that the rims are tight, they're butted up against one another where you can see no daylight. Okay, I'll check the outside tire just like I check the inside tire. Proper tread depth, even tread wear, no rips, cuts, or tears on the sidewall. Basically the same as I checked them up front. Okay, from there I go down to the rim. When I go down to the rim, I'm going to make sure there's no bends, cracks, or breaks in the rim. I'm going to make sure there's no welding repairs in the rim. From here, I'm going to do the lug nuts, make sure I got no broken, loose, and missing lug nuts. I could tell I had a broken, loose, and missing lug nut if I had rust trails or shiny threads. Again, it's a lot of the same information as Section A, but it's just in a different part of the truck. From here, I'm going to check the hub seal. I cannot check the level in this. This is a hub that's sealed. It's a unit that you can't check the fluid level in, but I want to make sure that it doesn't have any broken, loose, and missing nuts or bolts, and it's not leaking. The last thing that I personally always check is the valve stem. I'm going to check the valve stem itself. I'm going to make sure it's not cracked, bent, broken. It's not leaking. Sometimes they can leak. It also has a cap on the valve stem, and this is where I would check the air pressure on all 4 tires across the axle with the air pressure gauge. Okay, so now when I get done with those, I'm going to go back to my mud flap. And when I go back to my mud flap, I'm going to make sure there's no rips, cuts, tears in my mud flap. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted securely. It's not touching the tire. It's also not dragging on the ground. And then from my mud flap, I'm going to check my lights and reflectors here. I'm going to check all my safety reflective tape to make sure that it's clear and visible. It's a proper color, amber to the front, red to the rear. I'm going to check all my tail lights to make sure that they're clean. We're going to make sure that they function a little bit later on. Some of the functions that they'll check is stop lights, turn signals, running lights, and four-way flashers. So when they do your light check, you'll also you'll tell them that you're going to perform that light check. So now what I would do is the DMV examiner's instructions would be go to the other side and tell me what's different or unique. So we'll take a trip on over to the other side. Alright, so over on the other side, the only items that are really different on this side is the exhaust stack. So when I check my exhaust stack, again, I want to make sure it's securely mounted, make sure that all the guards are in place. I want to make sure there's no damage to the exhaust. Some of the damage that I'm looking for is any kinds of soot or carbon buildup, which would indicate an exhaust leak, that black stuff that you get on exhaust. I'm going to follow the exhaust all the way until it disappears, looking for those leaks, broken loose or missing clamps. And then if the engine's started, obviously I'm going to make sure that it's not leaking. You can hear it. Everything else is pretty much the same on this side of the truck, so there's no need to go over anything else, but just follow the DMV examiner's instructions. Just do what they tell you to do. What's different on the other side or unique? Piece of cake. So anyway, I just got finished with section B. Remember, if you got finished with section B, they would lead you into the fifth wheel again, and then you would do the in-cab. But now we're going to concentrate on section C and how they would perform it, or have you perform it. What they'll do in this case only is they'll have you start at the fifth wheel, continue on with the airlines, and then finish the rest of the trailer. Again, their instructions are going to be pre-trip one side of the truck by pointing to it or touching it with your stick or your hand, and then tell me what's different or unique on the other side of the trailer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the fifth wheel first. I'm going to do the airlines and then the trailer. So have to get down deep with me. This is the same information of when it was disconnected. So I'm going to check my base here. I'm going to make sure my base is securely fastened with no broken, loose, or missing mounting bolts. This is a sliding fifth wheel, so when I check my sliding fifth wheel here, I'm going to make sure I got no broken, loose, or missing teeth. These teeth are both welded and they're both bolted. Since it's a sliding fifth wheel, I want to make sure I have proper clearance between my mud flap and my landing gear so it's not going to hit when I turn. Also, since it's a sliding fifth wheel, I want to make sure that it's not going to accidentally slide by checking those pins to make sure that they're engaged and it's not going to accidentally slide. What controls those pins are the airlines, the nuts and bolts, the pistons, and the springs, and make sure that everything's all intact, nothing's cracked, damaged, or broken. I'm going to go up a level here to my platform. It's a pyramid looking thing here. I'm going to make sure that the platform is securely fastened also. Make sure there's no damage to it. Damage being a little bit of a vague word. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. Attached to my platform is my fifth wheel skid plate. My fifth wheel skid plate, before I hooked it up, I want to make sure there's no cracks, bends, or breaks in my fifth wheel skid plate. Make sure there's no damage. Everything was properly lubricated. I also want to check the gap in between my fifth wheel skid plate and my apron on my trailer. I want to make sure there's no gap in between it. Part of the check marks. And then we're going to go underneath it and we stick our stick up into the slot here, and we're going to make sure that the locking jaws are locked around the shank of the kingpin. We're going to test that a little bit later on with the tug. The kingpin, before we hooked it up, we want to make sure there's no damage to it. It's not cracked, damaged, or broken. I'm going to come back out and I'm going to tell you what controls those locking jaws. This is my hitch release arm right here. I want to make sure that it's engaged right now. I want to make sure it's in the locked and latched and safety latch position. The only thing that makes this safety latch is it's spring loaded. It's either in or it's out. From here, I'm going to check my apron and my trailer. My apron and my trailer is securely fastened to the frame. There's no cracks, broken, loose, or missing welds. Everything's properly lubricated. And then from here, I'm going to do my airlines. When I do my airlines, I want to make sure they're properly connected, red to red and blue to blue. I want to make sure that when I check my glad hands here, I want to make sure that the glad hands are properly coupled. The rubber in between the glad hands is soft and pliable, and it doesn't appear to be leaking. I'm going to check the condition of the lines. I want to make sure that they're long enough to permit turning, but they're not so long where they're dragging on the deck. I want to make sure they're not kinked, they're not cut, they're not cracked, they're not bulging, they're not leaking. I'm going to follow those air lines all the way back to the cab here. I'm going to make sure they're properly connected at the cab also, and they're also not leaking. From here, I'm going to check my electrical line to make sure it's properly plugged in and safety latched. I want to make sure again that my electrical line doesn't have any cuts, any breaks in it, no exposed wires, it's not taped or corroded or anything. It's long enough to permit proper turning, and it's plugged in and safety latched at the trailer end. Now I'm going to continue on with the trailer. This is a flatbed trailer, so I do not have a bulkhead here. If you did have a bulkhead, you would talk about it, but right now I'm running flatbed trailers. So I start at the front of the trailer. First thing I'm checking for is any kind of evident damage. I don't have any damage, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to check my ties and hooks right here. I want to make sure that my ties and hooks all operate smoothly. I want to make sure that they're welded securely to the trailer along with my hooks. I'm going to check the top of the trailer. I'm looking for any kind of broken, loose, or missing boards. I want to look for any debris that's stuck on the deck, something that could fall off when in transport. I don't see anything. Again, it's in good operating condition. I'm going to check the side of the trailer, and when I check the side of the trailer, I'm going to check my lights and reflectors and my safety reflective tape first. First thing I want to do is I'm going to make sure that all the lights are clean, clear, they're not cracked, damaged, or broken. All my safety reflective tape is clean, clear, and visible. Now anything that you've already done, you don't have to keep doing it, but you got to mention it. So I'll check all these ties and hooks all the way down this trailer to make sure that I checked them just like all those other ones in front. So as long as you did a good job on the front, you're good to go. Now we're going to go underneath the trailer. And when I go underneath the trailer, I'm going to check my frame and my cross members. And when I check my frame and my cross members, I want to make sure there's no cracks and bends or breaks in my frame, no broken, loose, and missing cross members. I'm also going to look on the boards on the bottom side and make sure they're not rotting or deteriorating. And I always like to make sure that my wires are not hanging down where they're not going to get caught up in my wheels when I'm driving down the road. Now I'll just move it over a little section here to my landing gear. My landing gear is both bolted and welded. So first I'm going to check all my welds and make sure they're all secure. Nothing's cracked, damaged, or broken. Make sure I got no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. I'm going to make sure the frame of my landing gear doesn't have any cracks, bends, or breaks in it, and it's all securely mounted. I'm going to check the feet of my landing gear to make sure they're in the fully raised upright position and there's no debris stuck on the feet. Okay, if you ever drop a trailer in rocks, you pick up rocks, you don't want to bounce down the road with those. Take out a windshield of a car. Lastly, I'm going to check my hitch or my handle, and what I want to do is I'm going to make sure that it operates smoothly and it's stowed properly for transport. And I'll continue down the trailer. I'll check all this frame and cross members just like I checked it up front, which brings me to the center of the axle here. All right, so I'm going to do the lines, make sure they're not ripped, cut, torn, not bulging, they're not leaking. They lead into my brake chamber right here. Brake chamber is securely fastened with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts to the backing plate here. There's no damage to my brake chamber itself. Make sure that it's not dented. I want to make sure it's not leaking. DMV is really big about this clamp around there, so I'm going to make sure that clamp is secure, it's in good condition. No broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. Sometimes they're welded. And obviously it's not leaking. The next thing is the push rod that comes out of the brake chamber. Push rod is straight, it's not cracked, bent, or broken. Proper adjustment for that push rod is no more than 1 inch when pulled by hand for proper adjustment. And the push rod is connected to my slack adjuster here with no broken, loose, or missing pins or clips. The slack adjuster also doesn't have any damage to it, not cracked, bent, or broken, no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts, and everything's operating correctly. From here, I'm going to stay with the brakes, and I'm going to do the brake shoes. I'm going to make sure I have 1/4 of an inch minimum thickness for the brake shoes. I want to make sure there's no oil or grease on my brake shoes. I want to make sure there's no cords, no separation or anything. I want to make sure the gap in between my brake shoes doesn't exceed 1/8 of an inch for proper adjustment. I want to make sure the drum itself is round. There's no cracks in it. There's no chunks missing out of it. There's no welding repairs. And on the brake shoes and the drums, I want to make sure there's no oil or grease. So the next thing after my brakes is I would check my suspension. Well, these spring mounts are welded, so I want to make sure that I check the welds in the spring mount. I want to make sure there's no cracks or missing welds. I'm going to check the spring mount themselves to make sure the spring mount doesn't have any damage to it. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. Attached to my spring mounts are my leaf springs right here. I want to make sure I got no broken, loose, or shifted, missing leaf springs. And the U-bolts hold leaf springs to the axle. I'm going to make sure the U-bolts are in good condition. And I'm going to make sure the nuts and bolts in the bottom of the U-bolts, or the nuts in the bottom of the U-bolts, none are broken, loose, or missing. Now what's different about this suspension is this bar right here is a torsion arm. So this torsion arm is securely fastened, again with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. There's no damage to my torque arm. It's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's securely fastened on the back end also. Obviously I'll check both sides. And then from here I'm going to do the tires. So when I do the tires next, I check them pretty much like I did in section B, but I'm going to go over it again. I'm going to make sure proper tread depth, 2/32 minimum tread depth. I can't have recaps, so I want to make sure there's no nails stuck in the tread, no cord separation. When I check in between the tires, I want to make sure there's no objects or debris that could be stuck in between the tires. I'm checking in between the tires also for the presence of a spacer block. I don't have a spacer block on this, and the tires are butted up against one another where you're not going to get wobble when you're going down the road. I check the outside tire just like I check the inside tire. And now I'm going to do the sidewall of the tire, and the next I do the sidewall of the tire, I'm going to make sure I check for any kind of rips, cuts, tears, bulges, manufacturing defects, anything that could be wrong with the tire, and then it's not leaking. I would check both sides of the tire on all four tires. I'm going to check the bead around the tire, make sure it's properly seated, doesn't appear to be leaking. I'm going to check the rim. I'm going to make sure it's not dented. I want to make sure it's round. I'm going to make sure there's no cracks in the rim and no welding repairs. From here, I'm going to check my lug nuts. I'm going to make sure I got no broken, loose, or missing lug nuts. Again, I could tell I had a broken, loose, or missing lug nut if I had rust trails or shiny threads. And next thing is my hub seal. I'm going to check my hub seal. I want to make sure it's securely fastened first with no broken, loose, or missing nuts or bolts. This is an item that does hold fluid, so I'm going to make sure it's not leaking. I also want to make sure, since I can check it through the sight glass here, that it's filled to the proper operating level above the add line. All right, the last thing that I always check is my valve stem. I'm going to make sure the valve stem is not cracked, damaged, or broken. It has a cap on it, and this is where I would fill the air pressure, or check the air pressure with an air pressure gauge on all four tires across the axle. Coming back to my mud flap, again, I want to make sure my mud flap is securely fastened. It's not ripped, it's not cut, it's not torn, it's not touching the tire, it's not dragging on the ground, it's all in good condition. I always reiterate one more time, I'm going to check my lights and reflectors one more time and make sure that they're red to the rear. Lights, I'm going to check a little bit later on in my pre-trip to make sure that they function. My reflectors are clean, clear, and this is not equipped with an ABS light. Some trailers will be. And then when I come around to the back of the trailer, I don't have any door here like I would on a box trailer, so I'm just going to start with what I see, just like reading a book. And I'm going to check all my safety reflective tape to make sure it's clean, it's visible. I'm going to check these ties and hooks to make sure that they're all securely welded in the event I got to tie something down. I'm going to check my lights. I'm going to make sure they're all red to the rear. Lights and reflectors are all red to the rear. Again, we're going to check their function a little bit later on in the pre-trip. The functions are my turn signals, my four-way flashers, my running lights, and my stop lights, as well as my license plate light and all three of my marker lights. We're going to make sure that they all function a little bit later on in the pre-trip. So this coupling device here is not part of your pre-trip because we've already done the coupling device there. But I always like to make sure that the glad hands are capped and covered and they're not leaking. And now DMV's instructions would be to pre-trip one side of the vehicle and tell them what's different on the other side. So let's go over to the other side and we'll see what the differences are. The toolbox. So the toolbox is mounted securely, and they don't really care too much of the toolbox, but there is a section where they ask for doors, ties, and lifts. So we already covered some of the ties. We don't have any lifts on this, but we do have a door here, so I want to make sure that door functions properly. It's locked and closed. It's not going to accidentally open up. The only other thing that's different is my spare tire holder, which you're not going to get credit for, but since they told me to check what's different, I want to make sure it's securely mounted. It's not going to accidentally fall out. Everything is exactly the same. So now DMV would say, let's get into the in-cab, and we're going to do an air pressure test or brake test, and we're going to do the in-cab inspection, and then they'll score you, and if you have enough points on your score sheet, they'll take you out and you'll do the skills. Alright, so the next part of the test would be the DMV examiner would instruct you to get inside of the in-cab. They're going to have you check your lights. Again, you're going to say this is going to double as my function check. And then when you get inside, when the DMV examiner gets inside of the cab, you're going to also get in, or be in. You're going to put on your seat belt, and when you put on your seat belt, you might as well pre-trip it. So when I put on my seat belt, I'm going to make sure it's not ripped, it's not cut, it's not torn. It latches inside of its holder. It's securely mounted both on the top and the bottom, and it's adjustable for me. The next thing I'm going to do is this, what's called the safe start. What a safe start is on a clutch vehicle is you always step on the clutch fully, and you make sure the truck's in neutral, make sure that your brakes are set. And when you fire the truck up, I turn the key on, I notice it's equipped with an ABS light. The ABS light self-checks the system, goes out signifying that it's working. Now I'm going to safely start the truck. And I'm going to start my brake test. Well, the number one thing that everybody always seems to forget on the brake test, and it has to be done, is to release the brakes. And what the releasing the brakes means is you're just basically pushing in the buttons. You're releasing the brakes. We're on level, flat ground, or the wheels would be chalked. Right? And now we're watching the air gauge right here. And the first thing we want to do is get the air gauge rising, because our first test is going to be governor cutout. The governor cutout on this truck is going to happen no greater than 140 pounds. So now that I've given you the parameter, I'm just going to tell you when it cuts out at. Okay? How are you going to know when it cuts out? It's when that needle stops rising. It's not when you hear that air dryer go off in a little bit. So you can help it out and give it a little bit of gas if you want to. Just hear that air dryer go off. So I look down at the gauge, and these gauges are in 40-pound increments. So this truck cut out at 130 pounds. The next thing you want to do is shut the truck off. Again, I'm already in neutral, my brakes are released. I'm going to put the truck in gear so it doesn't roll, and move on to the next test, which is called the applied test. So when I do the applied test, I want to make sure that I have full tanks. That's why I do it this way. Got to have full tanks for this test. I'm going to step on the brakes, and I'm going to hold it. I'm just going to wait about 10 or 15 seconds before I start my timer on my stopwatch. DMV requires you to fill up the entire system and make sure that everything stabilizes first. So now that it's stabilized, I know where my pressure is. I'm at 110 pounds, and I'm starting my test now. For this test, I can lose no more than 4 psi in 1 minute. I've got stopwatches in the truck. But the important thing that I'm trying to get here is I want to make sure that you guys wait before you start your test about 10 or 15 seconds, because if you just step on the brakes and start the stopwatch, it's an instant fail. So now, for time purposes, I'm going to say that that's a minute right now. And I did not lose any air. I saw no needle movement at all. Okay, now I'm going to let off the brakes, and I'm just going to continue to work that gauge down to the next set of numbers that I need to test. So the next number that I need to test is the low air warning. The low air warning light or buzzer, either one or the other must work, must happen no lower than 55. That's a change that DMV has made. It used to be between something, so now it's just no lower than 55 pounds. So no lower than 55 pounds, I should get instrumentation on the dashboard. So I'm going to pump it down. There, I got low air warning indicator, another low air warning indicator, and then 2 more red lights on the dashboard, signifying that it's working okay. Again, it's either light or buzzer. As long as one works, it's okay. Some trucks are wired differently. Anyway, the next test that I'm going to do is the emergency spring brakes. That's these buttons here. When these buttons pop out, I'm going to identify when they pop out at. They can pop out no lower than 20 pounds, okay? So what I usually do is I pump the brakes while I'm watching these buttons. I'm not looking at my gauge at all, because these buttons could pop out independently. So I just watch the buttons. They both popped out together. I go back to the gauge, and I got to read the gauge correctly. These are in 40-pound increments. It's about halfway up, so I'm going to add 20 to that bottom number. That's 40 pounds they popped out at. Common, easy math. I'm going to fire the truck back up, always with my safe start, and I have to build the air pressure back up all the way to finish my brake test, which is going to be the tug test. Remember, you got to have full tanks when you do this test. So you have to build the air all the way up. Now in previous videos, what I used to do is I used to do the in-cab while I'm building the air. But to simplify it, we're going to just cut to where I have full tanks, and we're going to do this test. And then I'll do the in-cab, and the in-cab has to be done with the engine running. So now that I have full tanks, what I'm going to do is with the next part of my brake test, which is the tug test, I'm going to push in one brake and not the other. I always start with the red one, and I put it in a lower forward gear. And all I'm going to do is ease my foot off the clutch here just a little bit, just till I feel it grab. I'm not going to dump it. And then I'm going to reverse these, and I'm going to take another tug. So what I did by doing that is I tugged the tractor, and I also tugged the trailer. So now I'm going to push both of these buttons in, which means I can roll. I'm going to roll forward about 10 or 15 feet. Just step on the clutch and the brake. Next, come to a nice smooth stop, and the vehicle doesn't pull to the right. It doesn't pull to the left. If it did pull to the right or the left, that would tell you a couple of things. Tell you that the brakes might be out of adjustment. It might tell you that you missed something up in the pre-trip, like oil or grease in the brake shoes. It's going to give you cause to look somewhere else. It's nice to have an answer for the DMV examiner if they ask you. So now that I'm done with my brake test, I'm going to continue on with my in-cab. In my in-cab, I do just like I do when I'm doing the outside of the pre-trip, almost like I'm reading a book. I take it a section at a time, a line at a time. So I'm going to start right here at the windshield. And when I start at the windshield, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure there's no chips in my windshield. I'm going to make sure it's clean, it's not cracked, damaged, or broken. I'm going to check the rubber seal around the windshield. It doesn't appear to be leaking. Next thing I come down to is my windshield wiper arms right here. I'm going to check my wiper arms and to make sure they're securely attached, they're not cracked, bent, or broken. I'm going to make sure the rubber is soft and pliable and it's touching the window. I'll demonstrate that they work just a little bit later on. And then from here, I'm going to check the top of my dashboard. I'll make sure that all my defroster vents are free and clear of any objects or debris that's going to impede my defroster. And then I come down to the front of the dashboard and I just read it like the next word in my sentence. Okay, this is my light switch, this is my panel dimmers. My four-way flashers function, and they function on the dashboard. Make sure you point to them. Okay, this is my water temperature gauge. It's at a safe operating level. This is my oil pressure gauge. It registered right after I started at the truck. It's at a safe operating level. That's my tach, my speedometer. I got plenty of fuel in both my DEF tank and my fuel tank for the trip. And this is a digital voltmeter. It's charging at 14 volts. Proper operating level. This is my parking brake. It's properly labeled. It's properly colored. And it also shows that it's applied on the dashboard. Not all trucks have that. Trailer air supply brake is also properly labeled, properly colored. This is my heater defroster controls. Okay, we're going to spell each one of these buttons out. This is my hot and cold. I'm going to leave it on hot. I'm going to put it on defrost or mix. And I'm going to turn on the fan, and it's blowing hot air out of both my defroster and my heater vents. Okay? Now I'm going to turn that off. Enjoy some air conditioning here. I'm going to go right up to the steering wheel. Steering wheel they took out years ago, but it's kind of a starting point. I'll make sure that there's no oil or grease on the steering wheel. What that's going to remind me to do is hit my horns. I got my city horn here, and my highway horn in the center. And now basically all I'm going to do is go down the column of the steering wheel, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my left turn signal. It shows you that it functions on the dashboard. I'm going to turn on my right turn signal and show you that it functions on the dashboard. I've already done my four-way flashers, and I'm going to do my high beam indicator and show you that it functions on the dashboard. Okay? Now I'm going to come over the other side of the steering wheel, and I'm going to pull this lever up one time and spray a little bit of juice on my windshield wipers and my washers. I'll let them cycle, and I don't have to fumble with the switch. So now this is just my step pattern of flow. The last thing that I always do is I go to my mirrors usually, and I make sure that they're adjusted for me, that they're clean, they're clear, they're not cracked, damaged, or broken. And then there's one other thing, it's emergency equipment. I used to do the emergency equipment when I was outside of the cab, but remember, you got your fire extinguisher, which is properly rated and properly charged underneath my seat. Our fuses are in the engine compartment, and I got 3 reflective safety triangles that are back of that seat that are clean, clear, they're not cracked, damaged, or broken. 3 of them. So that concludes my pre-trip, and the DMV examiner now would ask me if I'm done. If I said that I'm done, they might tell me to shut the truck off, and then they would add up the score points. And they have a scoring system on the back of their pre-trip sheet, and if you score the proper amount of points, you move on out to the skills. And then when you move on out to the skills, they have a whole different scoring system out there. I'll cover that in another video maybe one day. But anyway, that's the pre-trip. That's what to expect from the DMV examiner, and kind of how to run the pre-trip. Things doesn't have to be done exactly the same as mine, but it's a good pattern to follow. So anyway, with that, good luck on your pre-trip.